Tonight, we step into a mystery carved in parchment and whispered across oceans. A trail of maps that should not exist, coastlines drawn centuries too early, and symbols that may have carried directions disguised as faith. These fragments were not accidents. They were secrets hidden in plain sight. For most of us, the story of discovery begins in 1492, with Columbus setting sail into the unknown. But what if the Atlantic had already been crossed? What if, long before flags and royal charters, another order of men sailed west, armed not with glory but with silence? The Knights Templar, warriors, bankers, and guardians of knowledge. When their fleet vanished in 1307, history declared it lost. Yet, scattered clues suggest their ships may have reached a new shore, one they never claimed, but quietly mapped. This is not about planting empires. It is about hidden harbours, encoded charts, and a brotherhood that may have guarded the Atlantic's first crossings centuries before the textbooks allow. So, before you dismiss this as legend, ask yourself, what if the edge of the map was already known, but erased? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we follow the hidden Templar maps, and some voyages were never meant to be remembered. Imagine you are standing in a dimly lit auction room, the air heavy with dust and whispered anticipation. On the table before you is a fragment of parchment so fragile it trembles in the draught of every passing breath. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a ruined scrap, a relic too damaged to hold any meaning. But as your eyes trace the inked lines across its surface, a chill begins to spread. Because those curves and shapes, those jagged marks that edge the drawing, look disturbingly familiar. They resemble the shoreline of Nova Scotia. And here is the unsettling part. The parchment is written in a script that belongs not to the age of Columbus, not to the 15th century, but centuries earlier. What do you do with a map that should not exist? Who dares to draw coastlines before official discovery? And who dares to keep that knowledge hidden? This is the question that hums like a secret through history, passed from monks to knights to sailors who may have carried more than just swords and prayers. This torn parchment, this ghost of a chart, is not just a piece of old paper. It is a crack in the story we have been told. The seller of the map never spoke of its origins. Some say it was pried loose from a monastery library during the chaos of the French Revolution. Others whisper that it came from a private chest in La Rochelle, the last stronghold of the Templar fleet. Wherever it came from, its appearance sent shivers through those who saw it. Experts leaned close with magnifying glasses, tracing the ink strokes with careful fingers, and slowly the room filled with murmurs. Because this was not the work of an amateur sketching coastlines by chance. This was deliberate, detailed, measured by someone who knew the rhythms of sea and shore. Think of what it means. To suggest that someone had sailed west long before Columbus, long before official voyages dared to cut across the horizon. To suggest that the Atlantic was not an unknown wall of water, but a corridor already travelled. If the parchment is genuine, then it threatens to rewrite the edge of the map we thought was certain. Every detail matters. The script matches a medieval Latin hand used in the 13th century. The pigments are traced to iron gall ink, common in Europe before the 15th century. And the parchment itself bears scars of folding, as though it was carried, consulted, hidden, and perhaps hurriedly tucked away when danger came too close. The coastline it shows is not perfect. It wavers. But so too do all early maps. What is important is that it matches far too closely to the northern reaches of North America to be dismissed as coincidence. So here we stand, staring at a scrap of evidence that should not exist, that should have burned with time, or been buried with the bones of its maker. Who drew it? A monk guided by whispers of sailors. A Templar with access to charts seized from eastern vaults, or someone whose name has already been lost to silence. Whoever it was, they left behind a clue that waits like a message in a bottle, carried across centuries, daring us to ask the question no classroom ever teaches. What if the Atlantic was crossed long before Columbus? And what if the proof was hidden in plain sight? Every student learns the same neat story. In the year 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and found a new world waiting for him. It is recited like a rhyme, clean and simple, leaving no room for doubt. But history is rarely clean. What if that rhyme hides a question that almost no classroom dares to ask? Could the Templars, those warrior monks of the Middle Ages, have crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus unfurled his sails? The idea sounds impossible at first. We picture the medieval world as small and closed in, its maps filled with dragons at the edges, its sailors too frightened to wander past the horizon. Yet, when you look closer, the story begins to fray. The Templars were not ordinary knights. They were bankers, builders, and, most importantly, keepers of knowledge. They had ships, ports, and connections that spanned from Jerusalem to France to England, and when their order was crushed in the year 1307, many of their ships vanished into the night. Where did they go? No one has ever answered. Here lies the unsettling thought. If the Templars had the maps, the money, and the motive, could they have dared to push west into the unknown? And if they did, why would no one speak of it? The silence itself becomes suspicious. We know medieval chroniclers loved to brag about voyages, pilgrimages, even wild rumours of lands across the sea. Yet on this subject, the record is empty. It is a silence too perfect, as if someone pressed their hand over the mouth of history. Why would such a story be buried? One answer is power. Imagine if a knightly order discovered lands across the Atlantic centuries before the crowns of Spain and Portugal. Imagine if they charted safe harbours and secret routes. That knowledge would be priceless. But it would also be dangerous. Monarchs thrive on control. The Church thrives on control. A map that shows the world is bigger than you have been told. A map that proves discovery is not limited to kings or popes would shake that control. So the theory goes that the Templar voyages, if they happened, were hidden deliberately. Their maps locked away, their knowledge whispered only in guarded circles, their discoveries disguised as myths of islands in the mist. And over time the silence hardened into fact. Columbus became the first, because no one was allowed to remember those who came before. This is the heart of the mystery. Not just whether the Templars crossed the Atlantic, but why the possibility was erased so completely. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, it is not the presence of evidence that stands out. It is the absence. The missing records, the missing ships, the missing names. All of it creating a shadow where a story should be. No classroom will teach this because classrooms are built on consensus, on the comfort of certainty. But history is not certain. It is a tapestry full of holes, and through those holes you can sometimes glimpse another picture. A picture of knights steering west under starlight, their sails heavy with secrets, their maps folded deep in leather chests, and once you see that possibility, you cannot unsee it. Picture the city of Jerusalem in the year 1119. The air is filled with the scent of incense and dust, the sound of merchants in the markets, and the heavy toll of bells across the holy city. At the heart of it rises the Temple Mount, a place already ancient, already layered with centuries of faith and conflict. It was here that a small band of knights made their headquarters, men who would later be known as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, the Templars. History tells us they were there to protect pilgrims, but whispers tell another story, one buried beneath stone. These knights did not spend their early years patrolling roads or leading crusades. Instead, they were seen digging. Day after day, year after year, they tunneled beneath the Temple Mount. What were they searching for? Some chronicles dismiss it as construction work. Others hint at a secret mission sanctioned by hidden patrons. And the strangest rumours say that beneath those stones lay not just relics, but knowledge, charts, and scrolls that had survived empires, waiting in silence for someone bold enough to uncover them. Imagine for a moment what might have been hidden under Solomon's temple. This was a place where Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans had all left their mark. Each wave of empire carried texts, maps, and instruments of science. Ancient star charts, records of sea routes known to Phoenician traders who were masters of the Mediterranean and perhaps even beyond. If the Templars unearthed such things, it could explain their sudden rise from obscurity. They arrived in Jerusalem as poor knights with nothing but faith. They emerged years later with wealth, influence, and knowledge that seemed far beyond their station. Some stories claim they found the Ark of the Covenant or relics of Christ. Others point to something more subtle, but perhaps more powerful, the navigational secrets of the ancients. Imagine a scroll that described islands across the Western Sea, or a map that showed how the stars could guide you past the horizon. To the Church, such a discovery might threaten doctrine. To kings, it might threaten control, but to the Templars, it would mean freedom, the power to chart their own destiny, not bound by papal blessing or royal decree. When the order was later crushed in 1307, rumours of these discoveries resurfaced. Chroniclers wrote of tunnels filled in too quickly, of artifacts whisked away in silence. Pilgrims spoke of strange objects smuggled through ports at night. None of it is proven, but it is the consistency of the whispers that keeps the story alive. Too many voices across too many centuries saying the same thing, that the Templars dug for a reason, and they found something the world was not ready to see. So when we ask how a band of knights could vanish into history with ships no one ever found and maps no one can explain, the answer may lie beneath the Temple Mount. In tunnels carved by torchlight, in chambers sealed with dust, in scrolls inked long before Columbus was ever born. The question is not whether they dug, that part is recorded. The question is what they carried out in silence, and whether those hidden charts were the first step in a journey that crossed an ocean centuries before the world was told it was possible. The year was 1307, and the night was heavy with silence. In Paris, King Philip the Fair had already set his trap. Across France, Templar knights were being dragged from their beds, accused of heresy, shackled, and thrown into dungeons. The order that had once stood untouchable was suddenly shattered by the greed of a king and the blessing of a pope. But far from Paris, along the western coast of France, another story was unfolding. In the harbour of La Rochelle, the Templar fleet waited. Rows of ships with tall masts swaying in the salt air, cargo holds stocked, sails ready to catch the wind. La Rochelle was not just any port. It was the jewel of the Atlantic coast, a walled city whose harbour stretched into deep water, perfect for fleets bound beyond the horizon. For decades, it had been the Templars' lifeline, a hub for trade, finance, and quiet movements that no royal eye could fully track. And on the very night the arrests began, the records fall strangely quiet. The fleet that had anchored there simply vanished. Chroniclers speak in riddles. Some wrote that the ships slipped out under moonlight, guided by loyal hands who had been warned of the king's betrayal. Others suggest the fleet was already gone, dispersed weeks earlier to ports unknown. But the absence is undeniable. No inventories, no captured vessels, no treasure seized. For a king desperate to claim their wealth, this silence was infuriating. For history, it became one of its most enduring mysteries. Where did they go? The simplest answer is that the ships fled to safe harbours in Scotland or Portugal, lands where Templar allies could shield them. Another answer is darker and more daring, that they sailed further still, into waters few in Europe were supposed to know. If they carried maps, if they carried the knowledge whispered to have been uncovered in Jerusalem, then West was not just an empty gamble, it was a plan. Imagine the scene. Lanterns flicker as men load chests of documents, relics, and coin. Horses stamp nervously on the docks as ropes are cut loose. The The sails unfurl with a groan, catching the night wind. And in silence, without fanfare or record, the fleet drifts out into the Atlantic, disappearing into history. The next morning, when royal agents arrive, there is nothing left to seize. Only empty docks, footprints in the sand, and water rippling as if mocking the king's grasp. What happened to that fleet remains unknown. Some believe they reached Scotland and helped shape the birth of new secret orders. Some believe they melted into Portuguese fleets that later launched the Age of Discovery. And some whisper that a few brave captains kept sailing past the edge of the map, past the fog, toward a shore they already expected to find. La Rochelle became a port of shadows, a place where history lost track of a fleet, and perhaps of a discovery too dangerous to admit. It was here that the Templars made their final escape, not just from the wrath of a king, but from the official pages of history. And from that night onward, the question has lingered like salt in the air. Did those ships vanish into the depths, or did they carry their secrets across an ocean centuries before Columbus ever set sail? Long before compasses spun in brass casings and maps stretched across polished tables, sailors lifted their eyes to the sky. The stars were their guides, silent beacons etched into the night, whispering directions to those who knew how to read them. In the Middle Ages, when many believed the ocean was an endless wall of darkness, a few carried knowledge that turned the unknown into a path. This knowledge did not belong to kings or popes. It was borrowed, preserved, and hidden by circles of men who understood that the heavens themselves could be measured. The Greeks had begun the work centuries earlier. Pythagoras and Hipparchus spoke of geometry, angles, and spheres. They saw patterns in the heavens, rhythms that could be counted like a heartbeat. Later, Islamic scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba refined these tools. They built astrolabes of brass, instruments that could pin a star's height above the horizon and reveal a ship's latitude. They wrote books filled with tables of numbers, guides to tides, eclipses, and the secret highways of the sea. Their wisdom drifted quietly into Europe, carried by scholars and merchants, sometimes copied in monasteries, sometimes hidden in secret libraries where the church's suspicion could not reach. The Templars lived at the crossroads of this exchange. Stationed in the Holy Land, they saw firsthand the brilliance of Islamic astronomy. They traded with merchants who carried manuscripts in Arabic. Some knights returned to Europe with more than scars and relics. They carried instruments, star charts, and ideas. To admit such borrowings openly would have been dangerous. The Church guarded doctrine tightly and often dismissed Islamic science as heresy. So the knowledge lived in shadows, passed from lodge to lodge, shared in whispers between men sworn to secrecy. Celestial navigation is simple in theory, but profound in practice. By watching the North Star and measuring its angle, a sailor could know his latitude, the invisible line that circled the globe. By charting the rise of constellations and the drift of the moon, he could predict the turning of seasons and the pull of tides. Combined with careful logs of currents and winds, the ocean was no longer endless chaos. It became a system, a vast but predictable map written in light. For most of Europe, this was magic. For the Templars, it was opportunity. Imagine a knight standing on the deck of a ship at La Rochelle. In his hands is an astrolabe, its disc cold and heavy. He raises it to the sky, sights the North Star, and notes its angle. He marks it in a small book, a log that few eyes will ever see. Around him, the crew stares out at the black horizon. To them, the ocean is endless. To him, it is measured. The stars have told him where he is, and perhaps where he can go. It is no wonder that rumours began to swirl of Templar ships sailing further than anyone dared. If they possessed these tools, if they possessed charts copied from Arabic texts or fragments of Greek theory, then their voyages were not reckless leaps into the dark. They were calculated risks. They were guided by constellations that had watched over sailors for thousands of years. And perhaps, just perhaps, those constellations led them west, across waters the Church wanted no one to cross, toward a world that was never as unknown as we were taught. The Templars were famous for their white mantles marked with a red cross, a symbol of piety and sacrifice. But what if not every mark they carried was purely spiritual? What if some of their designs were more than decoration, more than ritual? What if they were a kind of code? Across ships, shields, and even on the skin of men themselves, strange patterns repeat. Lines, circles, stars, and knots that seem simple at first glance, but when studied carefully, begin to look like something else. They look like directions. In secret archives and old accounts, there are whispers of Templar tattoos, small crosses inked on shoulders, spirals etched into forearms, even bees and stars carved into rings worn under gloves. At the time, symbols like these could be dismissed as acts of faith or simple superstition. But sailors have always hidden their craft in marks. Fishermen carved notches into oars. Navigators tied knots in cords to count days at sea. What if the Templars turned their bodies and sails into living charts, visible only to those who knew the code? Think of the sails. Some depictions show crosses tilted slightly, not square but angled. Was it just artistic freedom, or was it a way to signal direction? An angled cross could mimic the tilt of the North Star above the horizon. A double line could represent a prevailing wind. The red and white themselves, arranged in patterns, might have been more than banners of faith. They could have been signals read across the waves, instructions in plain sight that outsiders mistook for piety. Sigils, carved into wood or stone, tell the same story. At commanderies in France and Portugal, strange markings linger on walls where the Templars once gathered, spirals that match whirlpools on ancient charts. Stars arranged not as random decoration, but in the order of constellations. One carving found near La Rochelle shows what looks like a compass rose, but simplified into a cross and 4 dots. To the untrained eye, it is a Christian symbol. To a navigator, it is a map of winds. Imagine a knight about to sail. He kneels in prayer, his robe draped with the red cross. But under that robe, ink coils across his arm, a spiral marking a route, a line marking latitude. His comrades see only devotion. His crew knows it means when to turn west. In this way, their faith and their voyages blurred together. Every mark could be read 2 ways, sacred to the Church, practical to the order. This double language may have been their greatest shield. By disguising directions as devotion, they could carry maps without carrying maps at all. A sailor with a tattoo cannot be accused of heresy, yet he holds a chart under his skin. A sail painted with a tilted cross looks like loyalty to Christ, yet it whispers of currents and stars to those who understand. So, when we look back at Templar symbols, scattered across ruins and relics, we may not be seeing only faith, we may be seeing an atlas. An atlas written in ink and thread, painted across sails, carved into stone, etched into flesh. Lines on skin, lines on sea. Together, they may have been the key that allowed the Order to hide their greatest maps in plain sight, carrying knowledge across oceans while the rest of the world saw nothing more than holy signs. In a quiet archive in southern France, a strange book sits under glass. Its pages are worn, its ink faded, yet the numbers and words it contains still spark debate among those who have studied it. It is called the Prior's Ledger, a Templar account book that should only detail ordinary matters, grain shipments, horse purchases, rents from lands. But mixed in with the routine lines of income and expense are entries that do not fit the life of a medieval monastery. They speak of Western provisioning, and they carry a symbol, a tiny bee seal pressed into the margins. Western provisioning. What could that mean in the year 1300? For most historians, the phrase should point to nothing more than supplies moving toward Portugal, or perhaps the distant Azores. Yet, the language feels different, broader, as though it refers not to a region within Europe, but something beyond it. Why not say Iberian? Why not say coastal? Why west? The ledger leaves no explanation, only numbers, quantities of grain, barrels of salted fish, casks of water, all the things a long sea voyage would demand. And then there is the bee. Again and again the seal appears beside certain cargoes, marking them as special, reserved, or perhaps bound for a different purpose. The bee was no random insect to the Templars. It had ancient meaning, tied to the Merovingian kings, tied to resurrection and divine rule. Centuries later, Napoleon would stitch golden bees into his robes, but here, long before his rise, the bee already hummed in silence on parchment. Was it a family mark, a sign of hidden authority, or was it something else, a signal that these goods were part of a voyage not meant to be remembered? Imagine the scene. A prior sits by candlelight, scratching numbers into parchment. He pauses, dips his quill, and presses a bee seal beside the entry. Around him, the monastery is quiet, its walls echoing with prayers. No one who walks past suspects that the book in front of him may be hiding a plan not for feeding villagers or supporting crusades, but for fueling journeys across the sea. Grain becomes ballast, fish becomes sustenance, water becomes survival, and the bee stands guard over it all, a silent code linking this cargo to something larger. Skeptics argue the ledger is a forgery, a clever invention from the 19th century meant to stir legends. And yet material studies of the ink and parchment suggest it is older, perhaps not from the 13th century itself, but close enough to trouble those who want the story to remain simple. The handwriting shifts, suggesting multiple scribes, as if the book passed from hand to hand, each adding to a secret record that never should have survived. The bee, the provisions, the West. Together they form a pattern that refuses to fade. If the Templars truly had ships ready at La Rochelle, if they truly vanished the night of the arrests, then a ledger like this could be the missing piece. Proof not of a landing in the New World, but of preparation for something beyond the horizon. A plan whispered in ink, sealed with a bee, and tucked away in a book that was never meant to be read by strangers centuries later. In the hushed light of a medieval scriptorium, monks bent over pages with steady hands, painting gold leaf halos and bright vines curling around sacred words. To the casual eye, their work was purely devotional, every page a prayer turned into art. But one psalter, preserved in a monastery in northern France, carries something far stranger. Tucked into the margin beside a hymn is not a vine, not a saint, but a thin, winding ribbon of coastline. At first, it seems like careless decoration, a flourish added by a bored scribe. But when scholars centuries later traced its shape and laid it over a modern map, the resemblance was undeniable. It matched the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the mouth of a river that cuts deep into the heart of Canada. How could such a shape appear in the 12th or 13th century? No one in Europe was supposed to know that land existed. Official discovery lay hundreds of years in the future. Yet the curve of the Gulf, the tapering arms of land, even the placement of small dots that seem to echo islands, all fit too neatly to be chance. Was this monk merely doodling? Or was he copying something whispered to him, something glimpsed on a chart passed quietly from sailor to sailor? The Psalter itself is filled with ordinary beauty. Saints kneel in prayer, angels lift trumpets, margins swirl with blue and red. But in one corner, where ink should have curled into leaves, a coastline stretches instead. And here lies the mystery. Why place it there? Why hide it in the margins of a book of prayer? Perhaps because the margin is the safest place. No one suspects the holy page of hiding a secret. No one examines a vine for signs of a new world. There are whispers that the Psalter belonged to a community with ties to the Templars. If so, the coastline might not be random at all. It might be part of a tradition, a way of disguising maps inside devotional texts, safe from prying eyes. To the untrained, it is art. To the initiated, it is direction, a hidden geography for those who knew how to look. Imagine the monk, his hand steady as he inks the thin blue line. He cannot speak of it aloud. He cannot write it openly on parchment meant for navigation, but in the margin of a psalter he can slip it past suspicion. He can leave behind a trail of ink that future eyes might one day recognize. Perhaps he never dreamed anyone would. Perhaps he only wanted to preserve a secret without naming it. Skeptics claim it is coincidence, the shape of a river mistaken for a gulf, the curve of a decorative flourish, overread by eager minds. But coincidence begins to lose its power when the shapes align too well, when dots fall where islands should be, when the gulf's mouth yawns open on parchment, written hundreds of years too early. The psalter's margin may be the faintest of maps, a coastal ribbon tucked beside sacred song, but if real, it changes everything. It suggests that knowledge of the western lands drifted into Europe quietly, secretly, centuries before Columbus. Not as conquest, not as proclamation, but as a whisper in the margin, waiting for someone to notice. Long before the age of discovery was credited to Spain and Portugal, there was another Henry whose name has almost been forgotten. Not Henry the Navigator of Portugal, but Henry Sinclair of Scotland, a nobleman tied by blood and loyalty to the fading echoes of the Templars. The year was 1398, almost a century before Columbus, when stories began to whisper of Sinclair's voyage across the Atlantic. Was it fantasy, a legend invented by dreamers, or did he carry with him something far more valuable than soldiers or gold? Did he carry maps? Henry Sinclair was not an ordinary noble. He ruled the Orkney Islands, perched on the northern edge of Scotland, a place where Norse tradition still pulsed and where the sea was not a barrier but a road. His family was tied to the Knights Templar, offering them refuge in Scotland when their order was dissolved elsewhere. If the Templars truly escaped with their ships from La Rochelle, it is not impossible that some of them found their way north, sheltered under Sinclair's protection. That bond raises the most intriguing question. If they carried treasures, what kind did they trust to him? Was it money to fund causes in exile, men to continue their mission, or maps charting coasts no one else in Europe had yet dared to claim? The tale of the voyage appears in later chronicles, describing how Sinclair led ships westward and may have reached the shores of Nova Scotia. Some even connect his expedition to mysterious carvings like the Westford Knight in Massachusetts, a faint outline of a sword-bearing figure cut into stone. Skeptics dismiss it as a glacial scratch, but the legend holds steady. The story goes that Sinclair and his men landed, met with native peoples, and established a brief presence before vanishing back into the silence of history. Why would Sinclair risk such a journey? One answer lies in politics. Scotland in the late 14th century was pressed on all sides, its alliances shifting between England, France, and Norway. Establishing a route west, even if only exploratory, could have given Sinclair leverage, a card to play in a dangerous game of crowns. But another answer may be tied more directly to the Templars. If they entrusted him with maps, fragments from their Jerusalem diggings, or from forgotten Mediterranean traders, then Sinclair might have been the only man willing to use them. Picture it, Sinclair standing on the deck of a long, narrow ship, the wind biting at his cloak, his men whispering nervously of endless waters. In his hand is a chart unlike any other, inked with lines that trace coasts unseen by his rivals. He is not gambling on blind faith. He is following a path already whispered in secret circles. The journey is perilous, but the reward is beyond measure. To step onto a shore no one else claims is to hold a secret that kings would kill to control. So when we speak of Prince Henry the Navigator, we usually mean the Portuguese noble of the 15th century. But perhaps the true first navigator was Henry Sinclair, a Scottish earl carrying the last embers of Templar knowledge. His voyage may not have reshaped the world in his lifetime, but it left behind a question that still lingers today. Did he carry men, money, or maps? And if it was maps, then the history of the Atlantic crossing did not begin with Columbus at all, but with a Sinclair sailing west under a banner of silence. Roslin Chapel rises on a hill near Edinburgh, its stones glowing warm in the Scottish light. its arches heavy with carvings that seem to breathe with secrets. Built in the mid-15th century by the Sinclair family, the same family tied to Henry Sinclair's rumoured voyage, the chapel has long been called a library in stone. Every surface is covered, not just with saints and angels, but with vines, knots, ships, and symbols that defy easy explanation. To walk inside, Roslin is to feel like you are being spoken to in a language you cannot fully translate. Some believe that language may include maps. On the ceiling, plants bloom in carved relief, but some of them do not belong to medieval Scotland. Scholars have pointed out carvings that resemble maize and aloe, plants unknown in Europe until after Columbus. How could they appear decades earlier? To skeptics, the answer is imagination, a mason copying shapes he had never seen in reality. But to those who follow the threads of the Sinclair tradition, the carvings are proof. Proof that someone connected to the chapel had already glimpsed the plants of the New World and preserved them in stone before the rest of Europe knew they existed. Elsewhere in the chapel, ships are carved into the margins. Not simple fishing boats, but vessels with tall masts and curved hulls, the kind designed to withstand long voyages. They are tucked into corners, almost hidden, but unmistakable once you see them. Were they mere decoration? Or were they echoes of journeys remembered by the family who built this place? Journeys west across an ocean that official history says no one had crossed. The knots are perhaps the strangest of all. Endless loops and spirals twist across arches and pillars, their patterns so precise that they seem to follow mathematical rules. Some researchers have suggested they are not just art, but codes. When traced carefully, the knots resemble currents, the looping gyres of the Atlantic, the swirling paths that sailors would need to understand to cross safely. Could the masons have hidden sea routes in these designs, embedding navigation into the very bones of the chapel? Imagine the Sinclairs commissioning Roslin not just as a house of worship, but as a vault of memory. Every carving a page, every symbol a sentence, the entire chapel a book that could not burn. Written in stone, its knowledge would outlast parchment, kings, and even the church. To those who knew the key, Roslin would not just inspire awe, it would instruct. Visitors today often sense the weight of mystery as they step inside. Light filters through stained glass and falls across carvings that seem almost alive. You notice details others miss. A ship here, a leaf there, a knot twisting into infinity. And the question whispers once again, was Roslin Chapel merely a monument of faith, or was it something more? A stone library built to preserve the memory of a voyage that carried not only men and money, but maps carved forever into stone, waiting centuries for eyes bold enough to see. On a quiet patch of land in Westford, Massachusetts, there lies a slab of granite that has stirred more argument than its rough surface suggests. Locals call it the Westford Knight, a carving said to show the faint outline of a sword, a shield, and the figure of a medieval warrior. To some, it is nothing more than scratches left by ice during the last glacial age, a natural mark with no meaning. To others, it is a memorial left by voyagers from across the Atlantic, perhaps even companions of Henry Sinclair, who may have reached these shores in the year 1398. The carving itself is not easy to see. Time and weather have worn the lines until they are almost invisible. Guides often trace them with chalk to help visitors glimpse the supposed shape. A long, straight line like a sword, a curve like a shield, a faint suggestion of armour. To believers, this is proof that medieval Europeans set foot in New England long before Columbus. To skeptics, it is a case of imagination filling in blanks, human eyes turning random scratches into a story. Heraldry complicates the picture. Some claim the shield bears marks tied to the Sinclair family, the same family whose name lingers at Roslin Chapel and in legends of a voyage to Nova Scotia. If true, it would be an astonishing link, a marker left by men who carried not only swords but perhaps Templar knowledge across the sea. But the stone refuses to speak clearly. The lines are too faint, the shapes too open to interpretation. Granite holds memory, but not always with clarity. The legend says that one of Sinclair's men died in battle or accident and was buried near Westford. The carving was said to be a memorial to him, etched by his comrades before they moved on. Imagine a small band of explorers far from home, carving one last tribute to a fallen knight before vanishing into history. The image is haunting, and it explains why the story has never faded. Even if the carving is only scratches, the idea of a knight's grave beneath New England soil continues to grip imagination. Archaeologists have studied the site and found no bones, no artifacts, nothing to anchor the legend firmly in fact. Yet, absence is not proof of nothing. Graves can be moved, stones can be lost, evidence can vanish in centuries of weather and growth. What remains is a debate carved as deeply into local memory as the faint lines in the granite itself. Stand before the stone, and you will feel the tension. Is this the ghost of a knight, watching over land he should never have seen, or is it simply a rock shaped by ice and hope? The Westford knight may never give a final answer. It sits quietly in the earth, holding its secret, daring each visitor to decide what they see. And perhaps that is the point. Whether scratch or memorial, it keeps alive the possibility that someone reached this shore long before Columbus, and chose to leave behind a mark too faint for certainty, yet too strange to ignore. On a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia lies one of the strangest mysteries in North America. Oak Island looks ordinary at first glance, its trees swaying in the wind, its shores lapped by the grey Atlantic. But beneath its soil sits a puzzle that has trapped treasure hunters for more than 2 centuries, a place known simply as the Money Pit. What began as a curious depression in the earth has grown into a legend of hidden vaults, flood tunnels, and booby traps that seem far too complex for ordinary settlers to have built. Some whisper that only a mind trained in strategy and secrecy, like that of a military order, could have designed such a thing. The story begins in the late 1700s, when a teenager noticed a circular indentation in the ground. Digging revealed layers of oak platforms placed every 10 feet, as though someone had deliberately built a shaft deep into the earth. At first, it seemed like the work of early settlers, but the deeper they dug, the stranger it became. More platforms appeared, along with traces of coconut fibre, a material foreign to Nova Scotia. How did coconut fibre, likely carried from the tropics, end up buried in a pit so far north? The deeper the diggers went, the more the island fought back. At 90 feet, they struck a stone carved with symbols. Soon after, water rushed in from hidden channels, flooding the shaft and ending the search. Later attempts discovered that the pit was connected to elaborate flood tunnels leading from the shore, designed to drown anyone who came too close to the treasure. This was no accident of nature, it was engineering. Careful, deliberate, and ruthless. Imagine what it would take to build such a system in the Middle Ages. Hundreds of workers, precise knowledge of tunnels and drainage, and a plan meant not just to hide something, but to protect it for centuries. This is why some researchers have linked the Money Pit to the Templars. They had the knowledge of fortification, the skill of military engineers, and the motive to guard something priceless. If their fleet escaped La Rochelle, if their maps and treasures crossed the Atlantic, Oak Island could have been their vault. Of course, skeptics argue that the Money Pit is simply a natural sinkhole dressed up in myth, but the details resist easy dismissal. Coconut fibre has been carbon dated to centuries before the island was settled. Flood tunnels show deliberate construction, and the repeating discovery of oak platforms makes the shaft feel more like a trap than an accident. It is not just a hole in the ground, it is a design. For generations, people have bled, broken, and even died trying to solve Oak Island. Every attempt feels like stepping into a game someone else planned long ago. A game that keeps its secrets close, protecting whatever lies below with water, wood, and silence. The island does not give up its truth easily, but the question lingers like the salt wind. Was Oak Island built by farmers with shovels, or by knights with a purpose, creating a trap for time itself, where history waits hidden beneath the earth? When the Templars were crushed in France in the year 1307, it seemed like the end of their order. Their leaders were executed, their wealth seized, their name dragged through trials of heresy. But in Portugal, something different happened. Instead of being destroyed, the Knights were quietly reborn. Under the blessing of King Denis, they were given a new name, the Order of Christ, and with it a new chance to survive in plain sight. What looked like obedience to the Pope was in truth a disguise. The Knights changed their banner, but their skills, their wealth, and their knowledge continued almost untouched. The Order of Christ grew into one of the most powerful forces in Portugal. They controlled vast lands, commanded fleets, and built fortresses that stretched along the coast. Their emblem, a red cross with flared ends, still carried echoes of the Templar tradition. And behind this symbol, hidden in plain view, the Knights may have preserved the secrets they had carried from Jerusalem and La Rochelle. If old maps existed, if charts of Western waters survived, then Portugal became the place where they could be used without fear. It was no accident that Portugal soon led Europe into the age of exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, the figure celebrated in textbooks, was governor of the Order of Christ. From their headquarters at Tomar, expeditions were planned, ships were funded, and knowledge of the seas spread. Officially, it was the dawn of a new era, guided by science and ambition. But in the quiet halls of Tomar, some believe the explorers consulted charts far older than their time, charts copied from Templar archives, and perhaps even traced from voyages that reached beyond the horizon centuries earlier. Think of it. Columbus is remembered for sailing west in 1492, but decades before him, Portuguese caravels were already pushing down the African coast, testing winds, and learning how to ride currents across the Atlantic. Madeira, the Azores, Cape Verde, each discovery seemed to come in quick succession, as if guided by more than chance. The Order of Christ funded these journeys, their coffers deep, their ships blessed not only by crowns but by secrecy. The connection is hard to ignore. The Templars vanish in one century. In the next, the Portuguese crown, backed by the Order of Christ, begins to explore with uncanny success. The knowledge may not have been invented anew. It may have been remembered, rebranded, and unfurled under a new flag. The disguise worked so well that most of the world forgot the Templar link entirely. But the red cross on the sails of Portuguese ships carried the memory forward. So, when we picture caravels gliding into the open sea, we should look closer at the symbols on their canvas. Those crosses were not merely signs of Christian faith. They were markers of continuity, the survival of a tradition that refused to die. Portugal's empire was built on courage and skill, yes, but also on memory. The Order of Christ may have been the mask, but behind it, the Templars still watched the horizon, still carried their charts, and still whispered of lands waiting far to the west. In the museums of Europe, you can still see them, Portolan charts, the great maps of the Middle Ages, drawn on vellum, lined with compass roses and spiderwebs of roots. They are marvels of accuracy, coastlines of the Mediterranean and Black Sea curve, with surprising precision. Harbours are marked, and winds are traced with care. But look west across the Atlantic edge, and the story changes. Where detail fills the east, the west falls into silence. No coasts, no islands, only empty space. At first it looks like ignorance, the simple absence of knowledge. But the longer you stare, the more it feels deliberate, as if something has been withheld. These blank spaces whisper of censorship. Medieval cartographers were not careless. They copied from earlier charts, from Arab sailors, from traders who carried tales of distant lands. They knew how to record even rumours. Many maps show phantom islands like Antilia or St. Brendan's Isle, proof that even uncertain reports could find their way onto parchment. So why leave the western edge so clean, so silent, so void of even speculation? It is almost too neat, too cautious. Some scholars argue that these gaps may hide the traces of knowledge guarded by secret circles. If sailors glimpsed land far across the sea, if fragments of maps existed in Templar or later Portuguese archives, they may have been deliberately erased from public versions. After all, maps were not only tools, they were power. A chart could mean the difference between survival and shipwreck, between discovery and death. And if rulers or orders wanted to control that power, they would not allow it to spread. Imagine a cartographer bent over his desk, carefully inking the coasts of Spain and Africa. His hand moves west, but then pauses. Perhaps he has seen a sketch of another shoreline, a fragment copied from a sailor's log. Perhaps he knows of an island beyond the horizon, but instead of drawing it, he leaves the space blank. Or worse, he washes the surface with ink so faint it looks like water. The silence is not ignorance, it is obedience. What makes the puzzle stronger is that some charts do show strange hints. A cluster of dots far out in the Atlantic. A faint line that mirrors the curve of a gulf. These details often vanish in later copies, as though someone decided they did not belong. This pattern of appearing and disappearing shapes suggests that the West was not unknown but unspeakable, a direction officially closed yet privately whispered about in lodges and ports. The silence itself becomes evidence. If the West was truly unknown, the maps would have shown imagination, guesses, and myths. Instead, they show restraint. They show an edge trimmed too clean, as if someone trimmed the story itself. And so the blank spaces of Portoland charts may be more revealing than their lines. They are not proof of ignorance, but of control, a cartographic pause that guarded secrets too large to admit. The latitudes of silence mark the place where history turned its face away, leaving behind a mystery still waiting on the edge of parchment. The bee is small, almost invisible, yet its trail through history is astonishing. In the tomb of Childeric, a Merovingian king of the 5th century, archaeologists discovered hundreds of tiny golden bees scattered around his body. They were not random ornaments. They were symbols, guardians placed like sentinels, to whisper of immortality, resurrection, and divine right. From that moment onward, the bee was more than an insect. It was a mark of sacred power, a sign that a ruler carried legitimacy not just from throne or sword, but from something older and holier. Centuries later, the bee hums again, this time in the shadows of the Templars. Some of their seals and ledgers carry the same emblem, pressed discreetly into margins or etched into stone. Why would warrior monks tied to Jerusalem and Christ's temple use the same image as the Merovingians? Perhaps because they saw themselves as guardians of a sacred line, a legacy too dangerous to announce but too important to forget. The bee became their quiet signal, a symbol that could pass through ports and lodges without suspicion. To those who knew, it meant sanctuary, protection, safe passage. To everyone else, it was decoration. The symbol did not die with the suppression of the Templars. It slipped into heraldry, resurfacing in crests of noble families across Europe. Sometimes, the bees cluster in groups of 3. Sometimes, they swarm across banners. In each case, they appear where connections to old secrets linger, as if marking bloodlines or alliances tied to something the world was not supposed to know. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, he chose not the fleur-de-lis of the French monarchy, but golden bees. He claimed it was to honour ancient kings, but perhaps he was also nodding to something older, something hidden. Now, imagine the bee carried further still. If Templar ships truly sailed west, if Sinclair or others reached the shores of Nova Scotia or beyond, then the bee may have marked their landfalls. A crest carved into stone, a motif stitched into cloth, even a hive symbol chiselled on wood could have been a beacon, a message to those who followed. You are safe here. You stand where others once stood. You are not alone. Colonial America carries faint echoes of this. Some early crests and seals include bees, often explained as symbols of hard work and industry. But why choose the bee over countless other emblems? Could it be that the meaning was older, that settlers brought with them a tradition they barely understood, carrying the emblem forward like a torch passed through time? Stand before a coat of arms, where 3 golden bees gleam, and ask yourself if it is only about diligence. Walk into Roslin Chapel and notice the bee carved near a saint's foot, too small to command attention, yet too precise to be an accident. The trail begins in a royal tomb, drifts through Templar seals, crosses into noble crests, and perhaps lands on colonial soil. The bee hums quietly across centuries, a code disguised as devotion, a beacon pointing towards safe havens across seas that history insists were unknown. When people think about the Atlantic in the 14th century, they imagine an endless wall of danger, waves as high as towers, storms that appear without warning, ships too fragile to survive the crossing. But the ocean is not chaos. It follows patterns. Currents, winds, and drift routes flow like invisible highways, steady enough to be mapped by those who paid attention. Once you begin to trace them, the idea of a medieval crossing shifts from impossible dream to risky but achievable voyage. The North Atlantic is shaped by a great circular system called the Gyre. Warm water from the Gulf Stream pushes northeast from the Americas toward Europe, while colder currents flow back south along the coast. For a ship leaving Europe, the winds near Portugal carry it down the African coast, but turning west at the right latitude, a sailor can catch the trade winds that sweep across the Atlantic toward the Caribbean. Returning home, the Gulf Stream and westerlies carry the ship back to Europe. This circle, discovered officially in the Age of Exploration, has been there all along. If the Templars had knowledge of it, even partially, they could have used it to attempt the crossing. Accidental voyages have proven the possibility. In the 15th century, fishermen blown off course reached the Azores. In the 16th century, African canoes drifted to the Caribbean. Even modern experiments with replicas of medieval ships have shown that with the right winds, a crossing could take just a few weeks. Danger was certain, but impossibility was not. For men with resources, courage, and secrecy, the Atlantic was a challenge, not a wall. The cold math strengthens the case. A ship sailing from La Rochelle could ride the westerlies towards Scotland or Portugal, then cut south into the trade winds. At the latitude of the Canaries, the winds would carry it straight toward the Americas. With supplies carefully rationed, a crew could survive the journey. If storms hit, the same currents would keep them moving west, whether they wanted to or not. And if their goal was Nova Scotia rather than the Caribbean, they could turn north, catching currents that curled toward the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Of course, most ships never attempted such voyages. The risk of mutiny, starvation, or simply never returning was too great. But the Templars were not ordinary sailors. They had money to fund preparation. They had access to maps and star charts gathered from Jerusalem, and they had motive to seek a place beyond the reach of kings and popes. For them, the gamble of the Atlantic may have been the only path to survival. Picture the deck of a 14th century ship at night. The waves heave, the sails strain, and the men huddle in silence. The navigator lifts his eyes to the stars and checks the North Star's angle. He knows the current beneath him is carrying them forward, whether they fear it or not. Land may be weeks away, or it may never appear, but the ocean itself is guiding them. The math of currents and chances whispers that the crossing, though perilous, was never beyond reach. It was always possible, waiting for someone daring enough to try. In the hills of central Portugal stands the Convento de Cristo, once the headquarters of the Order of Christ, the very order that rose from the ashes of the Templars. At first glance, it looks like any other medieval fortress monastery, its walls thick with history, its cloisters hushed with prayer. But step inside, and you begin to notice details that feel out of place. Octagonal towers rise where squares would have sufficed. Rotundas echo with geometry more fitting for ancient temples than Christian chapels, and carved into walls and ceilings are designs that seem less like decoration and more like a code. Among these strange details lies a mural that some believe may hold the key to an extraordinary secret, a star grid that mirrors the great gyre of the North Atlantic. The rotunda at the heart of the convent is unlike any other in Europe. Its octagonal form echoes the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, the site where the first Templars dug in the 12th century. Historians admit the resemblance is no accident. The architecture is a memory carved into stone, a direct line linking Portugal's new order with its forbidden ancestor. But the rotunda is not the only echo. Along the walls of the convent, in the quiet spaces where pilgrims seldom looked, a mural spreads across plaster. At first glance, it is a pattern of stars, arranged in neat lines and clusters. Yet, when charted carefully, the stars do not match the constellations of the European sky. They align instead with the currents of the Atlantic, mapping the gyre that sailors would one day use to cross and return. Imagine a monk with knowledge he cannot share openly. He lifts his brush, dips it in paint, and scatters stars across a wall. To the untrained eye, it is a devotional sky, a work of reverence. But to those with the right training, it is a chart. Each star placed where a current bends, each cluster pointing to a turning of winds. The mural becomes a codex, a guide disguised as art. The Convento de Cristo was more than a monastery. It was a school of navigation. The Order of Christ trained sailors who would later push into the Atlantic, discovering islands and routes that opened the age of exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator himself used its halls to gather knowledge, commission maps, and study charts. If a codex was hidden in plain sight on its walls, then it may have been one of the most valuable teaching tools in Europe, embedding ancient knowledge into sacred form. Skeptics dismiss the star grid as coincidence, a pattern imposed by later minds eager for connections. But the persistence of the design, its uncanny alignment with currents, and its placement in a convent tied directly to the Templars all resist easy dismissal. It is difficult not to wonder if the knowledge of the sea, gathered in Jerusalem or whispered from secret voyages, found refuge here. Walk through the convent today, and the silence feels heavy, as though the stones themselves remember more than they are willing to reveal. The octagons, the rotundas, the star mural, all whisper the same possibility. The Codex of Tomar was never a book bound in leather. It was a map painted on walls, encoded in architecture, hiding in plain sight for centuries. And if its grid truly mirrors the Atlantic gyre, then it proves that the men of the Order of Christ knew more than history admits, perhaps enough to follow the currents west long before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing. Along the rocky coast of Brittany, where waves crash against black cliffs and fog drifts in like a living wall, fishermen have always told stories. They speak of islands that rise from the mist, lands that appear on the horizon only to vanish again, places where the air smells different and the sea grows strangely calm. These tales stretch back long before Columbus, whispered across tavern tables and passed from father to son in coastal villages. To most they were legends, folklore meant to explain the mysteries of the sea. But what if they were more than stories? What if they were oral maps, fragments of memory that outlived the fragile parchment charts the Church preferred to forget? Breton sailors were among the most skilled in medieval Europe. Their boats roamed far beyond local waters, sometimes as far as Iceland and Greenland, where Norse outposts flickered in and out of history. They learned to trust not just stars and winds, but stories, descriptions of currents and landmarks passed in words instead of ink. A tale of an island shaped like a crescent, a coast where birds gathered in swarms, a shore where strange trees bent low against the wind. Each fragment may sound like myth, but stitched together, they begin to resemble something real. Some of the rumours spoke of Antillia, the Isle of Seven Cities, a place said to lie far to the west where bishops had fled centuries earlier. Others mentioned High Brazil, a phantom island that appeared once every 7 years. Cartographers sometimes drew these places faintly on maps, tucked into the blank Atlantic, as if acknowledging the whispers without daring to confirm them. But the Breton versions feel different. They do not describe paradise or magic. They describe fishing grounds. They describe islands where cod swam in such abundance that nets tore under the weight. They describe real places, practical and alive, not fantasies of gold. Picture a group of fishermen returning to port, their nets heavy, their faces weathered. In the tavern, they lean close, and murmur of a fog bank that parted to reveal land. They sketch it with fingers on a table, not on parchment. They never write it down, perhaps because they cannot, perhaps because they will not. Knowledge like that is too valuable to risk being taken. Oral tradition becomes their secret chart, safe from confiscation, alive only in memory. By the time Columbus set sail in 1492, these rumours were already centuries old. Some even suggest that Breton fishermen reached the Grand Banks of Newfoundland decades earlier, quietly harvesting cod and returning home without fanfare. The riches of the sea were reward enough. Why draw attention? Why risk crowns and popes demanding tribute? Silence preserved their discovery, but the stories slipped into legend, disguised as rumour. The Breton coast still hums with these tales. Islands beyond fog, vanishing coasts, seas that promised bounty to those who dared. Whether born from drifting ships or deliberate voyages, the stories remain. And in their persistence lies a possibility that paper maps can be burned or censored, but stories cannot. The Breton rumour may be the oldest surviving chart of the Atlantic, etched not in ink but in memory, guiding sailors across centuries with nothing more than words carried on the wind. In the forests of Nova Scotia and New England, the trees hold memories older than any map. Beneath layers of soil and peat, archaeologists have uncovered timber that tells a story of hands at work centuries before Columbus. Some of the logs carry strange marks, not the ragged edges of stone tools, but the straight clean cuts of iron blades. Alongside them lie stones arranged in patterns that do not look natural, alignments that suggest walls, drains, or platforms. To some researchers, these discoveries whisper of European visitors carving into the land long before official history allows. To others, they are coincidences, natural wear mistaken for human touch. Timber studies have pushed this debate into sharper focus. In certain sites, wood samples buried deep in coastal soil have been carbon dated to the 14th century. The puzzle is not their age, but their appearance. The ends of the logs are squared, as if chopped with metal axes. The surfaces show grooves, consistent with adzes, the same tools medieval Europeans used for shipbuilding. If the dating holds true, it would mean someone with European tools was cutting wood in North America decades before the Norse sagas faded and a full century before Columbus. Supporters of the theory point to places like Oak Island, where layers of oak platforms were found beneath the soil, their timbers showing signs of deliberate construction. Others mention drainage systems lined with carefully placed stones, too precise to be natural, too sophisticated for chance. These structures, they argue, reveal an engineering mind at work, a mind more like that of a military order than a scattered band of fishermen. But skeptics push back. They argue that tool marks can be misleading, that erosion and pressure can create straight lines where none were cut. They point out that radiocarbon dating is not flawless, that contamination from younger or older material can skew results. Some even suggest that later settlers disturbed the soil, leaving behind traces that confused modern analysis. The debate circles endlessly, each side insisting the other is reading too much or too little into the wood. Still, the evidence lingers like an itch. A cedar log buried where no settlement should have been, a stone wall aligned too neatly with the cardinal points, marks on wood that look too much like the swing of a steel axe to be dismissed as natural accident. The forest does not shout its truth, it whispers. Imagine a small party of men, landing on a Nova Scotia shore. They fell trees with practiced strokes, shaping timbers for a platform or a shelter. They dig into the earth, set stones in place, and leave behind traces that time tries to bury. Centuries later, those traces rise again, unearthed by curious hands, sparking questions that unsettle official timelines. Stone and cedar tell a quiet story, a story that may never be confirmed with certainty. But each discovery adds weight to the idea that Europe touched these shores before Columbus, that tool marks in forgotten timber might be the first footprints of a hidden crossing. The argument continues, but the woods still hold their secrets, waiting for the next hand to uncover them. The Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia have carried their stories through centuries, passing them from elder to child in words as steady as the tides. Among these stories are tales of visitors who came not in canoes but in great vessels with pale sails that caught the wind like wings. These visitors arrived long before the French or English claimed the land, long before maps recorded the coastline. The stories speak of men dressed in strange garments, carrying tools and objects unlike anything the Mi'kmaq had seen. Some accounts describe them not as conquerors, but as guests, travellers who stayed only briefly before vanishing again beyond the horizon. When European chroniclers much later recorded similar rumours of early crossings, the echoes were striking. Medieval accounts of Henry Sinclair's voyage in 1398 mention landfalls in the west and encounters with native peoples. Skeptics call these legends inventions, the product of romantic imaginations centuries after the supposed events. But when Mi'kmaq oral traditions recall pale-sailed visitors, the parallels become harder to dismiss. Oral history has its own way of remembering. It does not freeze events in parchment, but allows them to shift slightly with time, keeping the heart of the story alive even when details blur. The respectful tone of the Mi'kmaq legends is notable. They do not speak of violence or conquest, but of exchange. Visitors are remembered as curious, sometimes bewildered, but not hostile. In some stories they brought metal tools, sharp and gleaming, which astonished the Mi'kmaq. In others, they offered symbols, carvings, or trinkets that carried patterns foreign to the people of the coast. The tales suggest that the meeting was brief, yet it left enough of an impression to survive across centuries of retelling. Imagine a Mi'kmaq elder sitting by a fire, the children gathered close, the night alive with the sounds of the forest. He speaks of the time when the pale sails came. He describes the ships as floating lodges, the men as pale-skinned but weary, their eyes scanning the horizon as if they carried burdens from far away. The elder tells not of war, but of wonder, of the day when two worlds met across currents of respect. To the children, the story is not history but memory, alive and real, woven into the fabric of who they are. European chroniclers, when they stumbled upon these echoes centuries later, often dismissed them as coincidence. But some recorded them with curiosity, noting the uncanny overlap between native memory and old European rumours of voyages. It is possible that the Mi'kmaq preserved in their traditions what Europe tried to bury in silence. If knights or sailors did reach these shores, their presence was too fleeting to leave stone fortresses or written treaties. But they left something else, a memory that survived in the voices of those who met them. The knight and the Mi'kmaq may never meet again in the certainty of history books, yet their crossing lingers in the shared whispers of two traditions, one written, one spoken. Together, they suggest that the Atlantic was never an absolute barrier. It was a bridge, and across it moved not just ships but stories that still breathe in the firelight of the Mi'kmaq and the fading ink of European chronicles. In a quiet, private archive in Lisbon, tucked between brittle deeds and forgotten wills, lies a fragment that has puzzled the few who have seen it. It is called the Charter of the Unnamed Sea, a single sheet of vellum, worn thin at the edges, its ink faded but still legible under careful light. At first glance, it looks like a sailor's note, lines of numbers and words arranged in uneven columns, but mixed in with the familiar are strange marks, a cipher that scholars cannot fully agree upon. At its centre is a repeated phrase that translates roughly as "westing days." What those words mean has become the heart of the mystery. The fragment is too incomplete to tell a full story. The top portion is missing, torn away long ago. What survives begins with a series of crosses and circles, each paired with a number. Some believe these are days of travel, a schedule marking how long it would take to reach something west of Europe. Others argue they are not practical counts at all, but symbolic, perhaps a prayer to be recited in rhythm with the sea, each westing day another petition for safe passage. The writing itself flickers between devotion and calculation, as though the author was both navigator and monk. The cipher deepens the puzzle. The marks resemble shorthand, not letters but shapes, some like B's, others like spirals. These appear beside the word westing, almost like seals or signatures. If the fragment is authentic, then it suggests that whoever made it was disguising more than distance. They were hiding meaning itself, wrapping directions in symbols so that only initiates could read them. To the untrained eye, the page is noise. To the right reader, it may have been an itinerary across the sea. Those who argue for its authenticity point to the vellum and ink, both dating to the late 14th or early 15th century. That places it in the very decades when whispers of Sinclair, the Templars, and Portuguese exploration begin to blur together. Could the Carta be a surviving scrap of that lost knowledge, a note meant to guide ships westward using nothing more than faith, memory, and cipher? Skeptics insist it is a forgery planted centuries later to fuel legends. They point out the convenient use of symbols tied to Templar lore, too neat, too dramatic to be genuine. Yet the fragment resists easy dismissal. Its language shifts between Latin and Portuguese, with occasional words that suggest French influence. That mixture mirrors the crews who might have sailed from La Rochelle or Lisbon, bands of men who spoke across borders, united more by mission than by nation. The Carta feels like their voice, hurried and secret, a page meant for use, not display. Imagine a navigator bent over this fragment at night, tracing symbols by lantern glow as the ship creaks westward. Each mark tells him how long until the next adjustment, each word westing days, reminding him of time, of prayer, of direction. The page does not survive in full, but the idea it carries still breathes. That across an unnamed sea, someone kept count, someone prayed, someone planned. Whether schedule, itinerary, or devotion, the Carta of the Unnamed Sea whispers that the crossing was not just attempted but measured, one westing day at a time. In a damp corner of an old convent library, a set of manuscripts was found, their parchment stiff, their ink browned by centuries. At first glance, they were devotional texts, psalms copied line by line, prayers inked with the careful hand of women who had given their lives to silence and service. But hidden in the margins was something else. Small notes written in a lighter hand, almost playful compared to the solemn script of the prayers. These notes recorded eclipses and tides. The writer was not just a nun, but an observer, watching the sky and the sea with a curiosity that seems far more scientific than theological. The convent belonged to an order of anchoresses, women who often lived enclosed lives, devoted to contemplation. Yet even in their cloisters, the outside world pressed in. The moon waxed and waned above the convent roof. The tides swelled and fell against nearby shores, and one sister began to record them. Her marginalia lists dates of lunar eclipses, solar shadows, and the patterns of tides that followed. What makes this truly startling is how those dates line up. They match precisely with known weather windows in the North Atlantic, the rare stretches of calmer seas when a voyage west could be possible. Imagine the anchoress at her window slit, watching the moon darken in shadow on a cold night. She scratches a note in the margin of her psalter, marking not only the event, but the tide the following day. She does this again and again, building a quiet calendar of cycles. To the other sisters, it might have looked like idle doodling, but to someone who understood navigation, it was a treasure. a coded guide to when the seas might grant passage across the ocean. Why would a nun record such things? Some argue that monasteries and convents often kept weather notes to plan harvests and festivals. But the precision of these margins feels different. They are not just about planting or feasts. They are tied to windows when storms eased and currents flowed steadily west. It is as if she knew, or someone told her, that such data mattered not just for the land but for the sea. Historians have debated whether these notes could have been influenced by contact with sailors or scholars outside the convent. The Iberian Peninsula was alive with astronomical knowledge, much of it borrowed from Islamic sources. It is possible a visiting astronomer shared his craft with the anchoress, and she quietly kept track of what she learned. But the dates themselves keep pulling attention back to the Atlantic. The windows she highlighted were the very ones later explorers relied upon when launching expeditions to the west. Picture a navigator, centuries later, unfolding a borrowed psalter and tracing the marginalia with his finger. He sees the eclipses marked, the tides noted, the subtle rhythm of weather embedded in a nun's quiet hand. To him, it is more than piety, it is instruction. The anchoress may not have known it, but her margins could have been the bridge between cloistered prayer and oceanic daring. Her partnership with the astronomer, whether real or imagined, produced a code hidden in plain sight, guiding those bold enough to sail into the unknown. In the late Middle Ages, travel was often wrapped in the language of faith. Pilgrims set out with staffs and badges, bound for shrines where saints were said to work miracles. This cloak of piety offered more than spiritual protection. It provided a legal shield. Pilgrims were granted safe conduct across borders, their journeys blessed and respected in a way merchants or mercenaries could never hope for. Beneath this cloak, however, another story may have been unfolding. Some believe that the label of pilgrimage to Iceland or Greenland was not the destination at all, but a pretext, a cover for voyages that pushed farther and quieter into waters unrecorded. The North Atlantic had long been home to Norse settlements. Iceland thrived with its sagas and farms. Greenland clung to its edges of ice, and legends whispered of Vinland farther still. By the 14th century, official records spoke of pilgrims travelling to these outposts, sometimes to visit churches, sometimes to venerate relics said to have been carried by Norsemen. To the crown and the church, such journeys were legal, even noble. But to the sailors who made them, they also opened a route westward that required no explanation. With the banner of pilgrimage raised, a ship could sail into the Atlantic without drawing suspicion. Imagine a ship leaving a Breton or Portuguese harbour. The captain declares it bound for Greenland, carrying pilgrims eager to visit distant churches. Authorities nod, satisfied, for such journeys are rare but not forbidden. Supplies are loaded, crosses are carved on staffs, and prayers are offered for safe travel. Yet once the ship clears the horizon, the truth begins. The route veers slightly south or slightly west, following winds that lead not just to Greenland but beyond. The pilgrims may be real or only a name on a ledger, but the voyage carries more than prayer. It carries charts, symbols, perhaps even orders whispered in secret. Skeptics argue that such a theory stretches imagination. Why not simply sail as traders or explorers? But the answer lies in control. In the 14th century, the Church kept a close watch on unapproved voyages. Explorers who strayed too far risked charges of heresy or disobedience. Trade routes were jealously guarded by guilds and crowns. Only the pilgrim cloak allowed a ship to move quietly, unquestioned. It was the perfect disguise, one that transformed daring seafarers into harmless devotees. Oral traditions from Iceland even speak of strangers who arrived, claiming religious purpose, but seemed more interested in maps, stars, and currents than in shrines. Their presence was brief, their questions sharp, and then they vanished back into the sea. Such fragments align with the theory that pilgrimage was not always about salvation of the soul. Sometimes it was about salvation of a secret. The pilgrim's false cloak may never appear in surviving documents, for the very point of the disguise was to leave nothing behind. Yet the idea lingers because it fits too well. In a world where maps were censored and exploration restricted, faith became the mask that hid ambition. And behind that mask, ships may have slipped west, cloaked not in piety but in purpose, following routes that led far beyond the reach of the Church's gaze. Every mystery worth following eventually runs into a wall of resistance. In the case of the Templar maps and possible Atlantic crossings, that wall is made of historians, archaeologists, and scholars who guard the gates of accepted knowledge. Their voices are not cruel or dismissive for the sake of it. They are careful, trained to demand evidence that can be touched, measured, and verified. And when it comes to claims of medieval voyages to America, they insist the evidence is not enough. The strongest objection is the lack of written records. Medieval Europe was a world obsessed with documenting even the smallest transaction. Kings issued charters, monasteries kept chronicles, sailors wrote logs. If the Templars or their allies had crossed the Atlantic, skeptics ask, why does no surviving document clearly say so? Fragments, ciphers, and oral traditions are intriguing, but to scholars they do not outweigh silence in official archives. Absence may not prove impossibility, but in the eyes of historians it leans heavily toward doubt. Another barrier is archaeology. The Norse settlements at Lanceorc Meadows in Newfoundland left behind iron nails, turf houses, and tools, hard artifacts that anchor saga to soil. No comparable Templar or medieval European artifacts have been found farther south or west. Stones marked with strange lines, wood with unusual cuts, or carvings like the Westford Knight are all contested, open to interpretation, and therefore not enough. Without an undisputed artifact, something that can be dated and traced beyond debate, the case struggles to convince. Skeptics also point to ship technology. 14th century vessels could cross the Atlantic in theory, but in practice they were designed for coastal trade and Mediterranean voyages. Caravels and carracks, the ships that made Columbus possible, did not appear until the 15th century. The idea that Templar-era ships survived weeks on open ocean storms stretches credibility. Even if currents could carry them, the logistics of food, water, and crew endurance weigh against the story. There is also the problem of motive. Critics argue that the Templars, even in flight, had little reason to attempt such a dangerous gamble. Why would they risk everything on a voyage to an unknown west when safe havens existed in Scotland, Portugal, or other sympathetic lands? The idea that they carried secret treasures or bloodlines westward is seen as legend rather than strategy. To mainstream historians, the simpler answer is that the fleet scattered across familiar waters, not across the ocean. Finally, skeptics warn against patterns made from coincidence. A bee carved on a chapel, a star grid painted on a wall, a word scratched into stone can all be interesting. But when strung together, they can create an illusion of connection. The human mind loves patterns, loves to make sense of scattered clues. But not every echo is a signal. Sometimes it is only chance. These objections matter because they keep the debate grounded. They remind us that stories must be tested, not just told. The skeptics at the gate may frustrate those who long for a hidden truth, but they also protect history from turning into fantasy. And yet, as they stand watch, the whispers continue just beyond their reach, asking whether the absence they defend so strongly is itself part of the story. For every whispered mystery, there always comes a counterfeit. The story of Templar voyages and hidden maps is no exception. Over the centuries, a trail of forgeries has cluttered the path. False parchments, carved stones, and supposed chronicles designed to thrill collectors or mislead researchers. At first glance, these fakes seem like obstacles, muddying the search for truth. But looked at carefully, they reveal something surprising. Forgeries often follow real patterns, echoing methods, or symbols that hint at knowledge the forger may not have fully understood. In trying to invent a story, they sometimes preserve fragments of an older one. Take the case of the infamous Vinland map. Announced in the 1960s as a medieval chart showing North America, it captivated the world until chemical analysis revealed modern ink. Yet, even in its exposure as a fake, the map reflected a deeper truth. It followed Norse sagas that had long described land to the west, and it mirrored the way medieval maps mixed myth and reality. The forger drew from genuine currents of history, mimicking the very uncertainties that authentic maps contained. The falsehood still carried the shape of a possibility. Another example lies in carved stones, claimed to mark pre-Columbian voyages. Some, like the Kensington runestone, have been widely dismissed as modern creations. But the language carved into them, though flawed, often shows awareness of dialects and scripts, only rediscovered by scholars later. The forgers may have guessed, but in their guessing they sometimes stumbled into accuracy, highlighting methods that real voyagers could have used to mark territory. The mistake was not in the idea of runes on stone, but in the details that betrayed their modern hand. Even documents tied to the Priory of Sion hoax of the 20th century offer a strange mirror. The forgeries spoke of bloodlines, secret orders, and hidden maps in archives. While their creators admitted to invention, they anchored their inventions in genuine gaps of history, places where records are missing or suspiciously silent. By drawing attention to those gaps, the forgers accidentally revealed where real secrets might lie. Historians, frustrated by these deceptions, argue that hoaxes discredit serious research, and in many ways they do, yet they also serve as unintentional teachers. They show what kinds of stories resonate, what symbols persist, what gaps cry out to be filled. A forgery only works if it feels plausible. That means the forger must tap into veins of truth, even if only shallow ones. In doing so, they leave behind faint outlines of real patterns. Picture a counterfeiter hunched over a desk, copying the style of medieval ink. He invents a chart of western seas, filling in coastlines he never saw. But to make his creation believable, he studies genuine charts. He copies their rhythm, their errors, their style of notation. In this mimicry, he preserves the logic of authentic cartographers. Though his map is false, the method he imitates is real. So, what do forgeries teach us? They remind us that the line between truth and invention is narrow, that even lies can carry echoes of forgotten knowledge. They are warnings and clues at once, showing us how hungry the world is for the lost story of the Templars and their maps. And in their mistakes, sometimes, lies the shape of the truth they tried to counterfeit. When you look at a medieval cathedral from above, the geometry becomes obvious. Ratios of 3:1, circles inscribed in squares, alignments meant to echo divine order. The builders were not simply stacking stone, they were encoding harmony, placing faith in numbers they believed reflected the structure of creation itself. Now, imagine taking those same sacred ratios and laying them not on a cathedral floor, but on a coastline. With modern satellite tools, researchers have begun to overlay geometric grids onto coves and harbours, from Newfoundland to Cape Breton. What they've found is either a series of coincidences too pretty to ignore, or evidence of something more deliberate. In several inlets, the proportions of natural harbours line up almost perfectly with ratios used in medieval design. One bay curves in an arc that fits the golden ratio. Another cove forms a triangle that matches the Pythagorean 3-4-5 pattern. When plotted against star charts, some alignments even seem to echo constellations that medieval sailors used for navigation. To the casual eye, these are quirks of nature, random bends of land and sea. But to those looking through the lens of sacred geometry, the patterns appear too neat, as if someone had chosen these spots because they mirrored the numbers they trusted. Skeptics argue that with enough coastlines and enough ratios, matches are inevitable. The human mind is wired to find order, even in chaos, to see faces in clouds and symbols in sand. Yet the argument weakens when the same patterns repeat across multiple sites, separated by miles of ocean. If one harbour matches a sacred proportion, it might be chance. If 3 or 4 do, chance begins to feel less convincing. Picture a Templar navigator scanning the coast after weeks at sea. He would not have modern charts or satellite images. He would rely on instinct, on memory, on training steeped in numbers and symbols. If he saw a cove that mirrored the geometry of his chapel floor, he might trust it more. To him, that shape would not just be useful shelter. It would be a sign, a reflection of divine harmony, a place chosen by providence. The geometry would become a guide as real as any star. Modern overlays show that some of these harbours also align with prevailing currents and wind shelters. In other words, the geometry is not only symbolic, but practical. A bay shaped like a perfect arc is also a bay that blocks storms. A triangle-shaped inlet provides natural mooring points. What looks like mysticism may actually be engineering hidden inside faith. The ratios worked in stone, and they worked on water. So are these patterns coincidences or proof? The truth may lie between. The sacred geometry that filled cathedrals was also a way of thinking, a habit of seeing order in the world. If Templar voyagers brought that vision with them, they may have chosen harbours that fit their trusted ratios, blending mathematics, faith, and survival. The coastlines remain silent, their curves unchanging, but with every overlay, the question grows louder. Did the geometry of harbours guide the first hidden steps onto American shores? Rope was more than rope to the sailors of the Middle Ages. It was lifeline, anchor, and memory. In an age when few could read and charts were scarce, knowledge often travelled in the form of knots and cords. Mariners tied information into strands, building patterns that looked like prayers or charms, but carried instructions as clear as any map. Each knot could stand for a distance, a current, a turn of the stars. When strung together, the cord became a story of the sea, one that could be handled, recited, and remembered even in the dark. Some of these practices echo the quipu of the Andean peoples, cords with knots that held numbers and stories. In Europe, the versions were simpler, often passed off as rosaries or prayer cords. To an onlooker, a sailor fingering a string of knots might seem to be counting Hail Marys, but in truth he might have been recalling route markers, a rhythm of distances and directions that guided him across waters. Prayer and memory blurred, leaving only the sailor to know which was which. There are hints that the Templars and their heirs used these systems. Fragments in ledgers speak of tally cords sent with shipments, each marked with knots rather than ink. A rope preserved in a Portuguese monastery carries evenly spaced knots that some interpret as a record of days at sea. Others argue it is nothing more than a devotional aid. Yet, the dual use is what makes the system so effective. By disguising memory as prayer, navigators could carry their charts in plain sight, immune to suspicion from clerics or customs officers. Picture a sailor kneeling on deck at dusk, the cord wrapped around his fingers. He moves from knot to knot, whispering words that sound like devotion. To the crew it is faith, to him it is calculation. 3 knots means 3 days before the current turns. A larger knot signals a shoal to avoid. A spiral knot marks the latitude where the stars shift. By the time he finishes the prayer, he has rehearsed the entire route, carrying in his hands what parchment could not. Skeptics dismiss these theories as romantic, pointing out that no undisputed examples survive. But absence of evidence is expected. Rope rots, knots untie. Centuries do not preserve cord the way they preserve stone. What does survive are the echoes, the odd descriptions in chronicles of sailors with strange prayer habits, the accounts of knots carried as tokens far beyond their original use. Even in later centuries, fishermen in Brittany and the Azores were known to keep tally cords, patterns of knots that only their families understood. The beauty of the system was its secrecy. Anyone could carry a cord without drawing attention. A rosary might pass through 100 hands and never reveal that it held a map of currents or a timetable of westing days. In this way, memory became portable, resilient, and invisible. Messages in rope and knots may have been the hidden charts of the Atlantic, guiding ships across oceans under the disguise of prayer. The sea carried no parchment, but it carried cords, and those cords may have remembered paths long after ink had faded. Among the papers of the Sinclair family, tucked between records of marriages, dowries, and land disputes, lies a strange entry that refuses to blend into the rest. It is found in a ledger from the late 14th century, written in the same careful hand as the other accounts. The line is brief, almost casual, but its phrasing has sparked centuries of questions. It reads simply, "Allocation to the Western Vault." No explanation follows, no details of where or what the vault was. Just a note, as if everyone involved already knew. The Sinclairs of Roslin were no ordinary nobles. They had deep ties to the remnants of the Templars, offering them refuge when persecution swept through Europe. Their chapel, built with symbols that speak of both Christianity and older mysteries, suggests a family comfortable holding secrets. For them to keep a ledger that mentioned something called the Western Vault feels less like accident and more like intention. But what did the phrase mean? Was it a real vault, a place of stone and treasure across the sea? Or was it a metaphor, a way of disguising funds used for voyages that were never meant to be recorded? Imagine the ledger open on a desk, a candle flickering nearby. The scribe dips his quill, copies the familiar lists of dowries and tithes, then pauses at this curious entry. He writes it without hesitation, as though the words were understood by all who would read it. The Western Vault. To later eyes it looks like nonsense. To his, it was an instruction. Perhaps gold was being moved to fund a journey. Perhaps supplies were being purchased in secret. Or perhaps something of far greater importance was being hidden in a land no one dared name outright. Some researchers believe the Western Vault was a reference to Nova Scotia, a place where Sinclair tradition holds that Henry Sinclair himself voyaged in 1398. The idea is that the ledger preserves the financial trace of preparations, money that crossed borders as quietly as the ships that carried it. If this is true, then the entry stands as one of the few surviving paper hints that Europe's wealth may have seeded something in the New World before Columbus. Skeptics argue the term could have meant anything. A vault on the western side of the estate, a cellar used for storing grain, even a poetic phrase for a dowry chest. They remind us that words shift meaning over time and that family accounts were often riddled with shorthand known only to the household. Yet even in their dismissal, they admit the phrasing is odd. Vaults are usually named by purpose or location, not by compass direction, and the fact that the word west is singled out draws the imagination to oceans more than barns. Whether real or imagined, the ledger whispers of something hidden. If money moved west, what followed it? Was it men? Was it maps? Was it the continuation of a mission the Templars could not abandon? The Sinclair family left behind stone walls, filled with symbols and a paper trail just faint enough to raise questions. And in that faintness the Western Vault remains, not fully explained, not fully denied, a doorway written in ink that still opens toward the sea. In the middle of the 19th century, a cartographer named Alastair Mornay stepped briefly into the light of history before vanishing into its shadows. He was not a famous figure, not a royal surveyor or celebrated geographer, but a quiet mapmaker who worked along the coasts of Scotland and occasionally for private patrons. His reputation rested on precision, the kind of draftsman who could capture a shoreline with uncanny accuracy. Yet, one day, he presented something different, a chart he claimed was not his own invention, but a careful tracing of an older source. It showed what he called a westing path, a route across the Atlantic marked not with modern bearings, but with symbols and ratios that echoed medieval style. At first, he spoke of it openly, In letters that survived, he described how the original map had come to him from a private collection, fragile and half-faded, but still clear enough to copy. He hinted that it bore marks resembling Templar sigils, and that the path led not vaguely west, but directly toward Nova Scotia. His excitement was obvious, for he wrote of his intention to publish the tracing alongside an article on ancient navigation. To him, it was evidence that whispers of pre-Columbian voyages might have a concrete anchor. Then, without warning, Mornay retracted everything. Within a year, he wrote another letter claiming his tracing was an error, a misinterpretation of coastal marks that had been taken out of context. He insisted the original was lost and begged colleagues to forget his earlier claims. Not long after, he disappeared from public record. His workshop was shuttered, his name dropped from guild lists, and no burial or death notice was ever filed. It was as if the cartographer had walked off the edge of his own map. Speculation rushed to fill the silence. Some said he was discredited and died in poverty, ashamed of his mistake. Others whispered that he had been paid to stop, that powerful patrons with interests in preserving certain narratives had silenced him. In the 19th century, the age of exploration had already been claimed by Columbus and Cabot, and any challenge to that story threatened national pride and imperial identity. If Mornay's tracing suggested that Templars or their heirs had reached America centuries earlier, the revelation could undermine carefully built histories. Imagine him sitting at his desk, the tracing spread before him, symbols gleaming under lamplight. He knows what he has copied is old, older than any official chart should be. He feels both the thrill of discovery and the weight of danger. A knock at the door, a quiet conversation, an offer or a warning, and the tracing is folded away forever. His public retraction becomes not an admission of error, but an act of survival. To this day, no copy of Mornay's westing path has surfaced. Only scattered references in correspondence remind us it ever existed. But the mystery of the cartographer who disappeared remains. Was he a fool misled by imagination, or a witness to something too dangerous to publish? His silence is louder than his words, a gap in history that feels carefully drawn, like blank space on a map where land should be. The Knights Templar are remembered as warriors in white mantles, swords raised beneath a red cross, yet their true power did not come only from the battlefield. It came from their ledgers, from ink and coin that moved more swiftly than armies. By the 13th century, the Templars had built the closest thing medieval Europe had to an international bank. Pilgrims could deposit money in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem. Kings borrowed from them, merchants trusted them, and their preceptories spread like a web across continents. This network of wealth was not bound by borders. It flowed quietly, invisibly, leaving few traces except for the projects it sustained. Imagine what such a system could do for a voyage. Ships required timber, iron nails, tar, rope, food, and skilled crews. Normally, such expenses left a trail of contracts and receipts, documents monarchs or rival guilds could seize upon. But under the Templar system, money could be shifted through code, channeled from one preceptory to another, under the guise of donations, loans, or tithes. By the time the funds reached a port city, they appeared as nothing more than religious income. A ship could be built, supplied, and launched without raising suspicion that it carried a purpose beyond pilgrimage or trade. The records we do have show glimpses of how this might have worked. A sum entered in Aragon matched an expense in Portugal, with no mention of cargo. A donation in Normandy was mirrored by a withdrawal in La Rochelle, timed almost exactly with the outfitting of vessels. To most historians, these are ordinary financial patterns, but to those who study the hidden side of the order, they look like shadows of a larger plan. The system was built to protect secrecy. Every ledger was partial, every transaction cloaked in layered entries. What survived after the suppression of the Templars in 1307 is likely only a fraction of the true picture. Skeptics argue that funding a transatlantic voyage would have been beyond even the Templars' reach. But the sums they handled were vast, rivaling royal treasuries. They loaned to kings, financed crusades, and built fortresses across continents. Compared to those ventures, funding 2 or 3 ships to sail into the West was not impossible. The challenge was not cost, but discretion, and discretion was their craft. When the order was dissolved, many of its assets were supposedly seized by monarchs and the church, yet large portions vanished. Chronicles speak of wagons of treasure moved by night, of accounts closed before authorities could reach them. Some of that wealth may have been hidden in Europe, but the possibility that it was used to fund escape or exploration lingers. If a voyage westward was attempted, it would not have needed public approval or royal charter. The banking web of the Templars was already designed to act off the record, to make money disappear and reappear oceans away. The idea of Templar banking without borders transforms the question of possibility. It suggests that resources and secrecy were never the obstacle. The obstacle was only will, and if that will existed, the Order had both the means and the method to launch a crossing that would leave almost nothing behind but whispers. Step into a medieval chapel and let your eyes wander across the walls. You see bees carved into the margins of pillars, roses blooming in stained glass, crosses etched in stone. To most worshippers, these are decorations, symbols of faith, or reminders of scripture. But to a navigator trained to read more than words, these symbols could become something else entirely. They could be coordinates, a code hidden in plain sight, turning art into memory and memory into a map. Imagine a sailor standing before a chapel wall on the eve of departure. He studies not just the saints, but the placement of flowers carved in sequence. A rose here, a bee there, a cross above them both. To him, the arrangement does not merely speak of paradise or resurrection. It encodes directions. The rose signals east, the bee marks a harbour, the cross fixes the north. Together, they form a mnemonic, a way to recall bearings when parchment charts are too fragile to carry. The chapel becomes his notebook, the art his compass. The method works because the symbols themselves are universal, shared across faith and culture. A bee in Christian art suggests resurrection, but in a sailor's memory, it might also mark a safe haven or the point of return. A rose symbolises the Virgin, but in coded form, it can stand for the rising sun, the eastward mark of dawn. A cross is salvation, but also the intersection of latitude and longitude, the meeting of sky and sea. Layered meanings allow the code to exist unnoticed, hiding directions in devotion. One example, often discussed, lies in Roslin Chapel. Its carvings seem to arrange plants and patterns in sequences that echo constellations. To a pilgrim, it is beautiful but mysterious. To a navigator, it may have been instruction. Count the roses in a row, match them to stars in Orion, follow that bearing across the sea. Even if the exact reading has been lost, the principle remains. Chapel art could double as a secret atlas, teaching without ever writing the word map. Critics argue this interpretation stretches symbolism too far. They remind us that medieval churches were filled with imagery simply to teach scripture to the illiterate. But the overlap between religious and practical knowledge was not uncommon. Monks copied astronomical texts beside psalters. Builders encoded sacred geometry in cathedrals that also doubled as calendars. It is not impossible that sailors and Templars, bound to both faith and function, used their sacred spaces as places of coded instruction. Picture a young pilot on deck, facing the endless Atlantic. He closes his eyes and recalls the chapel. The bee carved low on the column reminds him of the harbour he must find. The rose above the altar points him east when he returns. The cross etched at the arch crowns his compass with north. His memory holds what no chart can, a code written in stone and glass, hidden in prayer yet alive in practice. When symbols become coordinates, the line between faith and navigation dissolves. What seems like decoration becomes direction, and what seems like devotion becomes survival. The chapel no longer stands only as a house of God. It stands as a map, waiting for the eyes that know how to read it. In the frozen soil of Greenland and the rocky shores of Labrador, archaeologists have found fragments that whisper of voyages long before Columbus. Iron nails pulled from turf, clinker planks shaped with tools, and traces of hearths where strangers once lit fires. These are usually credited to the Norse, whose sagas tell of settlements in Vinland around the year 1000. Yet scattered among the finds are details that do not fit neatly into the Norse story. Marks on wood that suggest different styles of cutting, nails of alloys not common to Viking blacksmiths, and fragments that hint at something else. Something that may have overlapped with the Norse but was not entirely theirs. The Norse presence is undeniable. At Lance Orks Meadows in Newfoundland, the outlines of turf houses stand as proof that their sagas spoke truth. But the site has always felt incomplete, more like a way station than a colony, and in surrounding regions, from Labrador to the inner fjords of Greenland, finds continue to complicate the picture. Some pieces of timber bear cross-cutting marks that look more like later European techniques than Viking tools. A handful of iron fragments tested in the 20th century suggested different smelting origins. Not enough to declare a new culture, but enough to stir questions. Could other Europeans have reached these shores after the Norse, but before Columbus? Some researchers point to the Templars, fleeing suppression in 1307, their ships unaccounted for as they vanished from La Rochelle. If even a few of those vessels pushed north, following routes the Norse had already pioneered, they could have reached Greenland or Labrador and left behind traces that blended into the older record. The overlap would be confusing to later archaeologists, who would find Norse artifacts alongside unfamiliar ones and assume them all to be Viking. Picture a small landing on the coast of Labrador. Norse settlers and strangers from the south trade quietly, exchanging timber for iron. A nail is hammered in one style, a plank cut in another. Fires burn in shared hearths, leaving ash and bone for the earth to preserve. Centuries later, the evidence emerges blurred, a collage of cultures reduced to fragments. To archaeologists, it is frustrating. To those chasing legends, it is tantalizing. Skeptics argue that all anomalies can be explained as variation within Norse craft. After all, Vikings themselves traded widely and could have adopted new methods or materials. But the persistence of these irregularities keeps the question alive. Why do some planks show saw cuts rather than adze marks? Why do certain nails not match the standard Norse recipe? Why do oral traditions among Inuit and Mi'kmaq speak of pale-sailed visitors who did not behave like Vikings? The cold archive of Greenland and Labrador is not a library of books but of soil and wood preserved by ice and time. It does not hand us a clear narrative. Instead, it presents fragments that overlap and contradict. The Norse story is strong, but around its edges are hints of another hand, another presence. Perhaps Templar, perhaps another forgotten voyage. The archive remains cold and incomplete, but it suggests that the Atlantic was never as empty as the textbooks once claimed. The old Portoland charts were meant to guide ships across familiar waters. They mapped the Mediterranean with astonishing accuracy, their coastlines traced as if drawn from the sky. But when those same charts stretch outward into the Atlantic, something curious happens. The edges grow vague, the lines uncertain, the parchment fading into blankness. For centuries, these gaps were dismissed as ignorance. Now digital scribes, modern artificial intelligence systems, are beginning to test that assumption. By comparing portolan outlines to the silhouettes of Atlantic coasts, the machines are uncovering anomalies. And strangely enough, the clusters keep circling back to Nova Scotia. The process works like this. Thousands of high-resolution scans of medieval charts are fed into a program trained to recognize shapes. It strips away decorative compass roses and sea monsters, focusing only on the hard lines of coast. Then it overlays those lines on modern maps, stretching and shifting until matches appear. In the Mediterranean, the results are flawless. But in the western margins, something unexpected flickers into view. Curves and angles that resemble the Gulf of St. Lawrence, bays that echo Nova Scotia's outline, peninsulas that should not exist in the 14th century. At first, researchers thought it was coincidence. After all, coastlines are full of arcs and points. But as the comparisons multiplied, the pattern persisted. The same shapes emerged across multiple charts from different centuries, drawn by different hands. The chance of repetition by accident shrank. It began to look less like random error and more like faint memory, copied and recopied by scribes who did not understand what they were preserving. Imagine a Templar navigator sketching a rough outline of a landfall, slipping it into a codex before the voyage is erased from memory. A century later, a cartographer in Genoa, tasked with filling blank spaces, borrows from the codex without realizing its origin. He traces the shape lightly, blending it with the known. Another century passes, and another scribe repeats the process, until the outline drifts into multiple maps. By the time scholars study them today, the shape is ghost-like, half hidden but still visible to a machine trained to see patterns beyond the human eye. Skeptics remind us that artificial intelligence can be fooled. The same algorithms that see cats in clouds can see Nova Scotia in a smudge of ink, but even they admit that the clustering is peculiar. The machines are not finding silhouettes in random places. They are finding them in the same region, again and again, as if memory has weight and refuses to scatter. The digital scribes have no agenda. They do not crave mystery or legend. They only match shapes. And in their silent calculations, they may be doing what medieval scribes once did by hand, carrying fragments of a forgotten voyage forward into the present. If the anomalies are real, then Nova Scotia was not a blank shore to Europeans. It was already outlined, faintly, in charts centuries too early. The question is not whether the machines see too much, but whether we have ignored too long what was always there. If the Templars, or their heirs, truly reached the shores of America before Columbus, one question rises louder than the rest. Why did they leave nothing behind that could not be doubted? No flag planted, no fortress raised, no proclamation carved in stone. Why come so far, only to vanish into silence? The answer may lie not in failure, but in choice. What they would have hidden tells us as much as what they might have found. A voyage across the Atlantic in the 14th century was not the age of conquest we imagine from later centuries. It would not have been about empire or glory. It would have been about survival. The Templars were fugitives after their suppression in 1307. Their fleet scattered, their leaders hunted, their order dissolved by papal decree. If they crossed the ocean, it would not have been with trumpets and banners. It would have been with secrecy, with the quiet intent of building safe harbours far from the reach of kings and popes. To plant a flag would have been to draw pursuit. To remain invisible was the strategy. There is also the possibility of trade. The Norse had spoken of timber, furs, and strange grapes in Vinland. If the Templars reached those shores, they may have sought only resources. Quiet coves to cut wood, to dry fish, to gather supplies that could feed voyages elsewhere. Such exchanges would leave little behind, only a trail of tool marks or the faintest hint of presence in oral memory. In that sense, their maps were not meant to guide conquest, but to mark resource points, a list of harbours, not territories. Some suggest that what they carried west was not treasure in the usual sense, but lineage and knowledge. If the legends of sacred bloodlines hold even a sliver of truth, then the maps themselves may have been treated as sacraments. To pass them down would be less about navigation and more about preservation, a way of ensuring that the story of who they were survived, even if their name did not. In this light, the maps were not political instruments, but family relics, guarded and hidden the way one might guard relics of saints. Imagine a ship slipping into a sheltered bay, the crew exhausted, the sails torn. They carve a cross into a tree, not as a marker for others to find, but as a private ritual. They sketch the outline of the cove into a ledger, then conceal it in a chest. No proclamation, no colony, just memory folded into secrecy. To them, the Atlantic crossing was not for glory, but for continuity. And continuity demanded silence. What they would have hidden is the very thing that still escapes us. They would have hidden roots, not kingdoms. Harbours, not castles. Symbols, not proclamations. Enough to sustain themselves, not enough to provoke their enemies. That choice left us with whispers instead of monuments, fragments instead of certainties. But it also explains why the story survives at all. Their silence was not failure, it was the point. Picture a chamber lit only by oil lamps, its air heavy with wax and silence. At the centre sits a scribe, not an ordinary monk, but one bound by oath. His task is to draw a map, not for kings or merchants, but for a brotherhood that survives in shadows. The parchment before him is calfskin, treated and smoothed to last centuries. Every line he makes must carry double meaning, so that only those initiated can read it. This is not just cartography, it is devotion disguised as ink. The hidden Templar map, if it ever existed, would not look like the clean charts we know today. Coastlines would be suggested with curves that might pass for decoration. A bay could be shown as a flower, a cape as a cross. Stars would appear in the margins, some meant as guides, others as ciphers. To the untrained eye, it would seem like a devotional work, filled with sacred geometry and biblical references. But to those taught the key, the symbols would unlock bearings and distances, a path across waters no one else dared admit existed. The cipher could be simple enough to survive memory. Perhaps each symbol matched a number, each number a unit of sailing days. A B might stand for a harbour, a rose for sunrise, a cross for true north. Together they would tell a story only those who had sworn the oath could follow. The map would not need to survive whole, even fragments could carry meaning. A strip showing a flower beside a star cluster might be enough for the next generation to recall the lesson. Materials mattered. Ink mixed with oak galls was known to last centuries. Gold leaf could highlight points of importance without fading, and the parchment itself, sealed in waxed leather or hidden in stone chests, could endure the dampness of vaults or the slow decay of monasteries. If copies were made, they would likely be disguised as psalters or books of hours, devotional works that no bishop would think to burn. In this way, the oath of secrecy became a kind of insurance. Imagine the map folded into a reliquary, placed beside the bones of a saint. Pilgrims would kneel before it, never knowing they prayed to a hidden coastline. Or picture it stitched into the binding of a family Bible, passed down through generations who might not even understand its weight until one day someone recognized the code. This is how such a map could survive in fragments, scattered across centuries, each piece waiting to be joined again. The oath behind it would be simple: to guard the map, not reveal it, unless survival demanded it, to keep it alive in symbol, in geometry, in ritual, even if the parchment itself crumbled. That oath would explain why the story persists, not in documents alone, but in art, architecture, and rumour. The hidden Templar map may never be found whole, but its fragments still speak, scattered across stone and script, a legacy preserved by silence as much as by ink. The torn parchment still rests at the centre of the mystery, a coastline sketched in faded ink, curves that resemble Nova Scotia centuries before Columbus. Its edges are frayed, its origin disputed, its handwriting too early for the age of discovery. And yet there it is, a relic that refuses to be dismissed. The parchment does not claim conquest. It does not show forts, banners, or colonies. What it suggests is quieter, but perhaps even more powerful: contact. Contact means that the ocean was not a wall but a bridge. It means that knowledge travelled farther and earlier than the textbooks admit. If authentic, the parchment would not erase the voyages of Columbus, but it would force us to see them differently. His ships would not be the first. They would be latecomers, heirs to paths already glimpsed by others. The edge of the map would no longer belong to one man in 1492. It would stretch backward into centuries of secrecy and silence. Imagine the moment it was drawn. A sailor stands on the deck of a ship, waves crashing against the hull. He watches the outline of a new land rise through mist. The quill in his hand moves quickly, tracing curves and bays, not knowing that the sketch will outlast him. For him it is practical, a memory to be carried home. For us it is revelation, a fragment that hints at a story never told in classrooms. Skeptics are right to be cautious. Forgeries abound, and the desire for mystery often blinds us to error. But caution should not erase possibility. History is filled with examples of knowledge hidden, suppressed, or ignored until rediscovered. The parchment is not a crown jewel of proof, it is a question mark in ink. And sometimes, a question mark is more dangerous than an answer. The shoreline it shows waits in silence. Waves still crash against Nova Scotia. Fishermen still cast nets where ships may once have anchored in secret. Forests grow thick where harbours might have offered shelter. The land remembers even when parchment fades. Oral traditions whisper of visitors with pale sails. Symbols etched in stone recall bees and crosses. Threads connect across centuries, fragile but persistent. To stand before the parchment is to feel history breathe differently. You realise that the story of discovery was never simple, never linear. It was not a single man sailing west, but a web of attempts, failures, and contacts, some hidden, some forgotten. The shoreline that waits is less about who arrived first, and more about how much we still do not know. And perhaps that is the real gift of the torn map. It does not shout conquest. It whispers possibility. It reminds us that edges of maps are never fixed, that history is not only what is written in bold ink, but also what survives in fragments. Contact is enough. Enough to change the story, enough to remind us that the Atlantic was crossed before the world was ready to admit it, and that somewhere on that faded parchment, the truth still lingers, waiting,